if anybody has any questions now. I live in Milwaukee. That beautiful young lady in the corner is my wife. She came up with me. And yeah, we planned on getting here at 5, but there's construction, as you know, on the freeway, and there was an accident.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Yeah, but so it got down to 1 lane for a while. I'm like, oh God, I thought I had this time so perfect. So anyway, but okay. Well, I think I will get started. I called this. I think we got. I forget when we scheduled this, Adam. It was a long time ago. I was gone all summer, and when I came back from back to the United States about a month ago, I was thinking, okay, I got to put this talk together. A lot of it was up here. It's just a matter of taking it from up here and putting it right here. But I really wanted to focus on eyewitnesses, the early explorers of the Fox, Wisconsin corridor. And again, this only scratches the surface. I could easily have made this talk 4 or 5 hours without any problem. Okay, we're really hitting the highlights. Right? I was talking with Adam a little bit about it. I encouraged him to maybe continue the research and write that 400-page book that I wanted to write for this topic. I'm sure he's just got oodles of time and resources here in his full-time job, so I'm just kidding, of course. But if you're interested, I'd be happy to be a resource and everything. Well, let me first thank the Historic Indian Agency House for inviting me this evening. One of my goals is to present some of my own research. Another goal, but the principal goal, is to present some of the more detailed descriptions of the Fox, Wisconsin Portage in the historical record, as well as the shifting human landscape in the area. In the interest of time, this has been a selective process, but I hope to give you an idea of the rich number of sources that are available and evidence of the importance of the Fox, Wisconsin Portage over the course of North American history. So let's start with the prehistoric era. Charles E. Brown was an early Wisconsin archaeologist who extensively surveyed prehistoric locations throughout the state. Even today, he worked in the 20th century. Even today, scholars rely on his notes. I've looked at his original notes at the State Historical Society. I have a couple archaeology friends who've also done that. In 1912, he reported the existence at Portage of, and this is one of your first quotes, a village site and graves on about the Kinsey Indian Agency House, on the E.C. Baker and adjoining farm on the bank of the Fox River. He also noted the existence of remnants of a linear mound south of the house. So there are Indian mounds around here, and he was good at finding them. Wisconsin has many types of prehistoric Indian mounds. What Brown described were almost certainly effigy mounds built between 700 AD and 1200 AD, a period labeled by archaeologists as the late woodland tradition. In fact, effigy mounds are found almost exclusively in Wisconsin. There's a few in Illinois and Iowa. And they largely consist of animal likenesses. Most likely these were clan symbols of the people who created them. Linear mounds depicted snakes, which native people associated with the underworld. Brown also noted the existence at the end of the Wisconsin River Bridge of an earlier conical mound, virtually every conical mound and most effigy mound contained human remains. So I got some of Charlie Brown, that's what he's affectionately called by historians and archaeologists. I have some of that in your handout. Now, I engage extensively with archaeologists, but I am a historian. Archaeologists work with artifacts, and there's a beautiful collection here in the Visitor Center. Historians work with documents. If the Historic Indian Agency House would like an archaeologist to come and visit and discuss the archaeology of the Portage area, I can make suggestions. Bob Birmingham, who my wife has met in a talk that he gave over the summer, would be an outstanding candidate. He's also done a lot of work on some of the historic forts in Wisconsin. But I will focus on the written and recorded history of the Portage. Yet even this cursory discussion of the archaeology is enough to suggest that the Fox, Wisconsin Portage has been a well-traveled route by native people for centuries, probably millennia. Even before the arrival of Europeans, early French sources and a raft of archaeological data support this conclusion. And this is one of the quotes I won't read, it's number 3. That I think is one of the most important quotes for understanding the late prehistory of the region. It was written by a French Jesuit based upon information that had been gathered from native people. Okay, I will now address one of the most common myths about the Portage, that in 1634, Jean Nicolet was the first European to cross the Portage. I have spent the last 17 years researching the career of Jean Nicolet. I have not done this alone. I've continued the work of the historical geographer Conrad Hodgeright and the late anthropologist Nancy Oestreich-Lurie, who I had the privilege of working with for well over a decade. I won't spend much time talking about Nicolet for that reason, but there's only a few short passages written about him, and they, even as short as those are, it is clear by reading them carefully and understanding what they say that he never traveled beyond Green Bay, and he most likely landed at what is today Marinette, Wisconsin. So, has anybody ever heard that Nicolet came through the Portage? Okay, that's not, he didn't, okay. I have a whole book written about why that's not true and how that not true thing came about. Nobody really intentionally lied. There's some historians who just didn't use the sources very carefully. The first Frenchman known to have crossed the Fox-Wisconsin Portage, without any doubt, was Father Jacques Marquette, a Roman Catholic priest of the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. Also his companion and mission leader, Louis Joliet, and 5 other Frenchmen. They arrived at a village of the Miamis, Mascoutins, and Kickapoos, about 7 miles above the Portage. Marquette, Joliet, and their French companions crossed the Portage on June 10th, 1637, with 2 guides furnished by the Miamis. And the Miamis were one of the local tribes. The Ho-Chunk, we'll get into, the Ho-Chunk are here, they leave, they come back. The human landscape has changed quite a bit more than most people probably understand. Marquette's description of the Upper Fox River as it neared the Portage was characteristic of many later accounts. He wrote of the difficulty of navigating the Fox River due to its extensive wild rice beds, the numerous twists of the river, and the river's narrow course. The area of the Fox headwaters, according to Marquette, and again, this is just, I gotta make sure, this is number 4 on page 2. The area is, quote, broken by so many swamps and small lakes that it is easy to lose one's way, especially as the river leading thither is so full of wild oats, which is what the French call wild rice, that it's difficult to find the channel. For this reason, we greatly needed our 2 Indian guides who safely conducted us to a portage of 2,700 paces, which is just about right on, and helped us to transport our canoes and to enter that river, the Wisconsin, which he would go on to name. Okay, and just real quick, it's he based it on a poorly he wrote a Miami word down for the name of the Wisconsin River. The name means where it lies red. It refers to a lot of the granite in the river and also to the dells. There's a linguist in Indiana who I've worked with before. He was the one who figured that out. Marquette and Joliet continued their journey to the Mississippi and reached the mouth of the Arkansas River before returning to St. Ignace in Upper Michigan. Now, after Marquette, you have a continual parade of French explorers, adventurers, and traders who passed through the Portage over the next century. French sources are sprinkled with references to French traders, many of whom were also diplomats. They were explorers, they were military officers, they had more than one role, traveling over the Portage, although only a few left any record of their crossings, and fewer still provided detailed descriptions of the landscape. One Jesuit missionary was Michael Ignac, and I have his is number 5. We don't have a picture of him, we don't know what he looked like. But he was serving on a French military expedition in 1727 against the Meskwaki Indians, also known as the Fox, who at the time were the principal native people in the vicinity. Again, the local Indian tribes, we'll get into why they shifted so much, but at the time in the 1720s, it was the Meskwaki, the Fox. And he wrote of the numerous bends in the river, the Fox River. He wrote, "Never was there a more tiresome voyage made than this that followed on account of the uncertainty regarding the route. No one knew it. We were continually going astray both by water and by land for lack of guides and pilots. We continued to grope our way, as it were, for a week, for we did not arrive until the 9th of September, 1727. And he was traveling with a large military contingent, most of whom had never been in the area. Towards 3 o'clock in the afternoon, by pure chance, believing ourselves still far away at the Portage of Wisconsin, which is 45 leagues from the Meskwakis, that's about 90 miles, counting the length of the turnings and windings of this wretched river, The Portage is half a league long, about 1.3 miles. He's right point there. The half of it being only a sort of swamp full of mud. The Wisconsin is quite a pretty river, but far inferior to what has been said of it. It is a shallow river upon a bed of shifting sand, which forms banks almost everywhere, which often change place. So, several facts become evident in these accounts. First, many early French travelers conducting themselves over the Portage noted the serpentine nature of the Upper Fox River and the difficult water course it provided. You hear stories about people, even later, being able to see Fort Winnebago in the agency house, half a day before they actually got to the Portage. It's just this meandering river. They also described the marshy, often difficult stretch of about 1.3 miles that separated the Fox from the Wisconsin River. This is repeated in other accounts, usually in less detail, such as those of Father Louis Hennepin, who accompanied René Robert Cavalier, Sieur de La Salle, in 1780, and Pierre Charles Le Sueur, who crossed the Portage in 1783. We don't have a picture of him. Second, the ethnic affiliations of the native groups that lived in the vicinity of the Portage shifted during the post-contact era. Now, this would be a separate talk in itself, all right? I could give that talk, but you're only going to get the bare bones tonight, okay? During the time of Nicolet, the Portage was likely occupied by the Ho-Chunks, or more accurately, the ancestors of the Ho-Chunks, who did not yet call themselves Ho-Chunk. That comes, 50, 60 years after Nicolet. And the Ho-Chunks lost 95%, the ancestors of the Ho-Chunks, let me put this right, they lost upwards of 95% of their population when they got into a war with the Illinois Confederacy to the south. And they suffered additionally as refugees of the Iroquois Wars put additional pressure on them in the 1660s. I'm just going to make a mental note to stop there. There's two series of very destructive wars, and it's not white against Indian, it's Indian against Indian. Now the war against the Illinois against the Ho-Chunk is very poorly documented. We would love nothing more as historians and archaeologists. We debate about this all the time, but we know that probably 95% of the Ho-Chunk's ancestors who were, we don't know what they called themselves, we know it wasn't the Ho-Chunk, lost their population. Now a much better war, which was probably just as destructive, was the War of the Iroquois. The wars of the Iroquois were in the eastern Great Lakes, and they forced many of the tribes in the lower peninsula of Michigan across the Lake Michigan into what is today Wisconsin. The Meskwakis were one of the native nations forced into Wisconsin. They're called the Fox here, along with the Sauk and the Scooten. And in the early 1700s, the Meskwakis, or Fox, became engaged in a war with the French and their native allies that almost resulted in their annihilation. And the survivors were forced into the Mississippi Valley, where they confederated with the Sauks, who were a very closely related people. Now, throughout the latter half of the 1700s, the Ho-Chunk people recovered their population. By the time we get to the early 1700s, they're actually calling themselves Ho-Chunk. I have a whole theory about that. That's a whole other talk. And they expanded into the lands of their ancestors. They pushed back toward Portage, and they ultimately pushed as far as the Mississippi. Those had been the lands of the Iowa Indians before, during the French era. Now, getting to the colonial part of this, the French relinquished control of the Great Lakes in 1763 at the conclusion of the French and Indian War. By the time the United States gained sovereignty with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, at the conclusion of the American Revolution, the Ho-Chunks had returned to the Portage and remained there until the removal era, which comes after the War of 1812. Okay, so you get quite a lot of change. So just to kind of sum up, this is what Wisconsin looks like when Nicolet arrives in 1640. You have these massive wars. The Iroquois Wars are the best documented, and this is what Wisconsin looks like much later. Many of the tribes had originally lived in the lower peninsula. Now, I have a short clip here. It's like 6 minutes, but it's a bit irreverent at times. It's about the Iroquois Wars, which are called the Beaver Wars. Let me show it to you first, because I think most people just don't know this. I do, but I have to. It's my job. And I'll tell you what's right and wrong about it, but I think it's really interesting. Let's watch. Okay, so Yeah, he gets a couple things wrong, believe me. It had, at least in the beginning of the war, had less to do with Beaver. It had more to do with taking war captives. But again, that's a whole nother talk. And it's not a footnote to me. This is what I do for a living, is study that type of activity. Now, during the British period, again, we'll skip back to look at what happens after the French and Indian War, which I'm not going to go into. The first English-speaking observer entered the region, namely Jonathan Carver. He was actually a Connecticut Yankee, and he was interested in surveying the lands that Britain had recently acquired in the French and Indian War. And he traveled in the Western Great Lakes between 1766 and 68, and he wrote the first book that provided the first accessible descriptions of the Western Great Lakes in English to Anglophone audiences, such as the Eastern colonists and of the 13 original colonies. His description of the Portage, which he called the carrying place, is one of the most detailed. It's also one of the most interesting, and it's even poetic, and therefore it should be quoted at length. And that is number 6. The Fox River serpentines for 5 miles, only to gain in that place 1/4 of a mile. The carrying place between the Fox and Wisconsin rivers, and that was how the French spelled Wisconsin, is in breadth not more than 1 3/4 miles, though in some maps it is so delineated as to appear 10 miles. And here I cannot help remarking that all the maps of these parts I have ever seen are very erroneous. The rivers in general are described as running in different directions than they really do. The distance of places likewise are greatly misrepresented. Whether this was done by the French geographers, for all the English maps are copied from theirs, through design, or for want of a just knowledge of the country, I cannot say. But I am satisfied that travelers who depend upon them in the parts I visited will find themselves much at a loss. Now, near 1/2 of the way between the rivers is a morass, and overgrown with a kind of long grass, and the rest a plain, with some few oak and pine trees growing thereon. I observed here a great number of rattlesnakes. I observed that the main body of the Fox River came from the southwest, that of the Wisconsin from the northeast. And you can see on one of the maps, this was an English map based on French maps. I mean, the Fox River is to the north, and that looks like about 10 miles. It's not even 2 miles. Okay, so I can see where he would have been upset with a lot of the maps. They just weren't well made. Okay. Where was I? I observed the main body of the Fox River came from the southwest, that of the Wisconsin from the northeast, and that also that some of the branches of these 2 rivers doubled within a few feet of each other, a little to the south of the carrying place. The 2 such rivers should take their rise so near one another, each other, and after running such different courses, empty themselves into the sea at a distance so amazing, for the former having passed through several Great Lakes, runs upwards of 2,000 miles, falls into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and the other, after joining the Mississippi and run an equal number of miles, disembogues itself into the Gulf of Mexico. And I had to look up the word disembogues, is an instance scarcely to be met in the extensive continent of North America. Now, Carver also mentioned the residence of one of the first settlers at Portage, a man named Pinachon. Likely other than Frenchmen preceded Pinachon. We don't know. The records are not as good as you think. All of these Frenchmen offered their services to traders requiring assistance to Portage's 2 rivers. We know little about Pinachon, but we know a great deal more about Pierre Paquette, who, like many residents of early Wisconsin, was a mix of native and French ancestry. Paquette was likely born around 1800 and established himself at the Portage in about 1818. There he lived as a trader and translator, as he was fluent in both French and Ho-Chunk. He even offered his services to the United States during the Blackhawk War of 1832. Other French residents saw a parade of British and American military forces pass through the Portage from the time of the British ascendancy in 1763 and throughout the period of American sovereignty after the War of 1812. After the War of 1812, the United States established a series of military posts in the region, one of which was Fort Crawford at Prairie du Chien. Colonel Henry Leavenworth crossed the Portage in June 1819 with the 5th Infantry Regiment en route to Fort Crawford. The record of that journey is available only in manuscript from the National Archives, and I have a copy if anyone wants to see it. And it relates significant details. The author was actually Captain Henry Whiting. And he wrote in a florid style that rivals that of Carter. In fact, I'm willing to bet a lot of what Whiting describes he got from a copy of Carter. Whiting wrote, and this is number 7, the intermediate country appearing to be prairie is interspersed with large clumps of oaks, looking like islands studding an immense sea of verdure. The horizon is everywhere skirted with hills, which may have been the ancient barriers of a great lake, drained off by the 2 avenues of the Fox and Wisconsin rivers. And these wooded spots were doubtless islands in its bosom. The portage is over a marshy prairie at 2,500 yards long, low and generally wet. The Frenchman's house, who keeps this portage, likely a man named Francis Leroy, is on the route. He has 4 or 5 teams adapted to the transportation of baggage and boats. We're on the apex of the point, and the eye embraced a view of the two rivers. And it was not without feelings of enthusiasm and awe that one contemplated the singular and interesting scene. 2 rivers, apparently divided by no barrier, running nearly parallel with each other for several miles, distinctly opposite in their courses, without any visible cause for contrasity, another word I had to look up, presents a paradoxical phenomenon which the mind is unable to reconcile with physical rules. Now, Whiting continued his ruminations for several more pages. He also included sketches of the portage. Those were found separately of the log at the National Archives. And if you ever want to go to the National Archives, remember, they don't have millions of documents there. They have millions of cubic feet of documents. It's not an easy place to find anything. And Whiting noted somewhat prophetically that, quote, the practicality of a canal has often been the subject of speculation. He also wrote that one of the cost of the portage keeper for the passage of the 5th Regiment was $8 for a bateau, which was a large flatboat, $5 for smaller boats, and $7 per load of baggage. That was a pretty hefty sum for the day, considering the regiment moved in 32 bateaux, $8 a pop. And again, you figure your average working man made about $30 a month, so it was not a cheap trip across the portage for the 5th Infantry Regiment. Now, the Meskwakis, as noted, had largely abandoned the Fox, Wisconsin waterway by the 1780s. And the Ho-Chunks, who at the time resided predominantly in the lower Fox River and the Lake Winnebago prior to this time, they began to migrate into these open lands that were abandoned by the Meskwaki in the 1760s. One of the migrants to the portage was Chugiga, which means spoon or ladle in Ho-Chunk. And he was the eldest son of Glory of the Morning, or Hobo, I said I wasn't going to mess this up, Hobo Guiga. Shown here, this is a contemporary idealized image. She married a French officer, Joseph Sabrogor de Cari, and she went on to found one of the most prominent Ho-Chunk families in Wisconsin history, the Decoras. And among the Wisconsin Ho-Chunk, there are still many people named Decoras, sometimes spelled Decory. Now, we have 2 excellent sources that illustrate the Ho-Chunk population around the portage in the 1820s and 1830s. The first is a hand-drawn map by Lucius Lyon, the Deputy Surveyor General of Michigan Territory, of which Wisconsin was then part. This and other maps, this is another one that's very similar, indicate that the principal Ho-Chunk villages in the region were largely located on the Baraboo River, which is not too far by. So we have several maps that show exactly where village locations were. Another important source, and this is another one, both these are manuscript sources, they're not published. In 1829, Indian agent John Kinsey completed the census of the Ho-Chunk villages. It noted 3 villages stood on the Baraboo River. The lower village of 10 lodges, about 200 persons, led by Heap Chon Wan Sep Ka, or Old Decorah. The middle village, 3 lodges, 50 people, led by Kaish Kipa, and the upper village of 7 lodges, 130 people, led by Petit Sioux, making for a total of about 20 lodges and 380 people. So that's a really valuable source. There's several archaeologists I've worked with, and that's kind of like one of our Bibles for figuring out village locations and populations for the time. This brings us to the most well-known residents of the portage, John Kinsey and his wife Juliet, whose 1856 book, Waban, the Early Day in the Northwest, provides one of the most important historical sources for pre-settlement Wisconsin, for the portage. As she describes her life as an Indian agent's wife during their tenure at the portage, from 1829 to 1834. And I will say as an aside, I'm sure Adam you'll appreciate this, there are copies of the reprints of Wadman available for sale here. I would recommend anyone to get it. It just makes for a great reading, okay? This is the original title page from the original edition. Juliet's description of traveling to the Portage echoes much of what we've already heard. She wrote, quote, "The wild rice abounds to that extent in many places," and this is number 8, we got quite a bit by her, that in many places it almost completely obstructs the progress of even a moderate-sized boat, so that a passage through its tangled masses is with difficulty forced by the oars, tedious and monotonous as was the whole course of the following 2 days. That's just a common refrain. The Fox River is serpentine, it's just clogged with wild rice and other growth, and it's just a long, hard slog to actually get to the Portage. The great value of her book is in its description of frontier life, life at a frontier army post. Fort Winnebago had been built in 1828 in the wake of the 1827 Winnebago Uprising, a revolt by factions of the Ho-Chunks under Redbird that became enraged by the rising number of white settlers in the lead mining region of southwestern Wisconsin. While I've extensively researched the 1827 Winnebago Uprising, or Ho-Chunk Uprising, we need not concern ourselves with it here. Again, that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother talk. But Julia Kinsey offers 2 very valuable contributions. First of all, she provides very detailed descriptions of the Portage in the 1820s and 30s that allow us to reconstruct the layout of Fort Winnebago and its environs, including the Indian Agency House where we are right now, where she and her husband resided. The rich lithographs that accompany her book have been reproduced many times since the 1850s. Matter of fact, I was pleasantly surprised to see one of them on the counter in front as I walked in tonight. As for her description of the area surrounding Fort Winnebago, and this is also in your handout, the bold promontory on which Fort Winnebago was built looked down upon the extended prairie and the Fox River on one side, and on the other stretched away into the thickly wooded ridge that led off to Lake Puckaway. In front lay an extent of meadow, across which was the Portage Road of about 2 miles in length, leading between the Fox and Wisconsin rivers. Teams of oxen and a driver were kept at the agency by the government to transport the canoes of the Indians across the place, which at many times was wet, miry, and almost impassable. Second, Kinsey paints a very rich picture of the social world that existed at the Portage. My 30-year career as an historian has focused on Native-white relations in the Western Great Lakes region, and I found Kinsey to be one of my go-to sources for understanding how Native society, particularly the Ho-Chunks, interacted with the United States government and its land-hungry population after the War of 1812. Yet another topic I have researched extensively is the 1832 Blackhawk War, during which Fort Winnebago and the Portage became hubs of military and diplomatic activity. Julia Kinsey provided rich detail about the whirl of events, all of which are again the topic of another talk. Suffice to say that Kinsey wrote a great deal about the tense days of the Blackhawk War in the summer of 1832, and she described one instance where an unknown party of Native people approached the agency house at the height of the conflict. Our hearts trembled, and it must surely be the enemy. At this moment, my husband appeared in the direction of the interpreter's house. To our infinite joy, we saw the chief of the party dismount, and all the others following his example and approaching to shake hands. A space was soon cleared around the leader and my husband when the former commenced an oration, flourishing his sword with much violent gesticulation. At length the speech was concluded, another shaking of hands took place, and we saw my husband leading the way to his storehouse, from which some of his men presently brought tobacco and pipes, and laid them at the feet of the chief. Our suspense was soon relieved by being informed that the strangers were Man-Eater, the principal chief of the Rock River Indians, who had come with his band to hold a talk and bring information, which he means is intelligence about the Blackhawk's band. Some Ho-Chunk bands supported Blackhawk, others did not. The Ho-Chunk had a lot of political divisions. They were not a single united tribe, at least not in their foreign relations. So, in a presentation of this length, I can only touch on some of the sources that provide historians with the textual evidence used to weave the narrative of the human past. I had to be selective. There were many other texts I was forced to omit. As I proceeded to put this presentation together, I realized the extensive number of documentary sources that exist on this topic, and hopefully this talk will spur some additional research into those sources. I was hoping, for example, to address the failed attempt to build a canal across the Portage in the 1830s, the remnants of which today lay directly in front of the Indian Agency House. Nevertheless, as Shakespeare said, brevity is the soul of wit, so I will conclude at this point, and I will take any of your questions. So yes, ma'am.
Where did the word Winnebago come from?
Okay, the word Winnebago, first of all, it's an Algonquian word. The Ho-Chunk spoke Chiwerie-Siouan. They were kind of outliers in that they were this Chiwerie-Siouan population surrounded mostly by Algonquian speakers. And that would be the Chippewa, the Ottawa, the Menominee, the Potawatomi. And Chiwerie-Siouan languages are as different from Algonquian languages as English is from Mandarin Chinese, literally. They're that different. But originally, and this goes all the way back to the time of Nicolay, the Ho-Chunk lived around Green Bay, which in the spring can be pretty pungent if you've ever been up there. It takes on a pretty bad odor. And it literally, Winnebago meant people of the stinky water. And it just stuck with them right to the present day. There's a branch of the tribe in Nebraska, they still use Winnebago. But the name of the Ho-Chunk, Ho-Chunk-Ra, that literally means people of the big voice. And it's because the Ho-Chunk claim that they're descendants of other Chiwerie-Siouan speakers, such as the Iowa, the Missouri, and the Oto, who lived farther to the west. And one of my theories, and one of the things I'm trying to work with several archaeologists on, going back to the 1640 map, it's clear that there was a Chiwerie-Siouan line that stretched from Green Bay all the way out to the Great Plains that included all the Chiwerie-Siouan tribes. And again, archaeologically, that's pretty clear that that happened. But anyway, the Ho-Chunk were, as I said, almost literally completely wiped out. Their ancestors, they didn't use the word Ho-Chunk until probably at least the early 1700s. But the word Winnebago is Algonquian. They always, from the 1700s onward, they always called themselves Ho-Chunk-Ra, people of the big voice, or people of the primal or first voice, and all the other Chiwerie-Siouans were descended from that.
Because when I was a kid, they were known as the Winnebago.
Yeah, they were, and they kept that name. It was in the 1990s they decided, they always called themselves Ho-Chunk in their own language, they always did. But they were always called Winnebagos by others. It was in the 1990s, and go back to Nancy Lurie, she was very active in helping them get a tribal government established here. And by the 1990s, they decided to go back to using Ho-Chunk. Their brethren in Nebraska still use Winnebago, but in their language they use the word Ho-Chunk. So it was a conscious decision on the tribe's part. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
The early French explorers that were here, did they have a translator with them? I mean, how accurate
Okay,
is
well,
what they portray?
Okay, well, first of all, we go back to Nicolay. As I say, I've written 2 books about the guy. Know 1 or 2 things about him. He was fluent in French, of course. He was born there, but he was probably about 16 or 17 when he came to North America. And what his boss, Stanley de Champlain, did, he said, "Okay, we're going to send you up the Ottawa River to live among the Huron." And you're going to spend the next 2 years there. See you in 2 years. Learn the language, learn the customs. Best of luck. Then after that, he spent, I think, 10 years among the Algonquians. He became fluent. What the French did is they would simply take young boys, sometimes just not even in their teens, and just send them to live with the tribes. And they would pick the languages up really fast. The other big thing, we go back to Paquette. His mother was a Ho-Chunk. His father was French. He was just born speaking both of the languages. So, the French mastered the languages a lot faster than you would think. You take a 12-year-old kid and put him among strangers alone for 2 years, he'll pick the language up real fast. So, you'd be surprised how quickly the French were master. If they were going to have a relationship with the tribe, they wanted to talk to them. And there were also fur traders who just decided to live among the tribes, and they picked up the languages. The French were really good about having their own people master the native languages. Any other questions? And virtually all the interpreters were French. I would imagine Kinsey's, and I'd have to look it up, but I'm sure Kinsey's interpreter was French. A lot of times they had a French interpreter to talk to the Indians, then a French-English interpreter. A lot of Americans spoke French as a second language back then. Other questions?
Were most of the explorers French?
Well, the early ones, I mean, before Carver, they were all French. I don't think there were any English-speaking people west of Lake Michigan, or I'd have to look that up. But Carver really is, for all practical purposes, one of the first English speakers. Yeah, they were all French because it was part of the French trade network. I don't like to call it the French Empire because they really didn't have that great a control. But they had good relationships with all the tribes. Like I said, they learned the languages quickly. They developed excellent relationships with them. And, and they jealously trying to keep the English and the Dutch out. And the English were always trying to sort of tap into the Western Great Lakes. The Dutch were too. So yeah, they were all French. The French did everything they could to keep non-French people out. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
There is this is a little off the subject, but
Sure.
I've often wondered about it. We're known for our mounds, Indian mounds in this area, and
Sure.
there's an area about 10 miles north of here that's called Moundville.
Mhm.
And I've often wondered if there's mounds in that area.
I'm sure there are. Okay, first of all, as far as mounds, I mean, go back to Brown here. There were a couple people who extensively cataloged all the mounds, many of which have now been destroyed. I'm sure Moundville had a lot of mounds. The first was Increase A. Lapham. He went around the 1850s when only a few mounds had been destroyed, and he wrote a book called The Antiquities of Wisconsin, which is still an important source. Brown, his notes at the State Historical Society, they're just voluminous. So virtually every place, probably all the original mounds, or just about all of them, were cataloged by somebody. There are thousands, even today, even after thousands have been destroyed through farming and construction and road building, there are still thousands and thousands of mounds. And now they've developed this technology called LiDAR, which you put it on a drone, you fly it over a landscape, it can kind of peer through the vegetation. My friend Bob Birmingham, who, if you're going to have anybody come here to talk about mounds, particularly in this area, Bob Birmingham. He's entertaining guy. He's about this tall. He's pure energy. You love him. He's done more work on Wisconsin Indian mounds. He's written 2 books on the subject. But yes, there are. This is just the effigy mounds. Okay, keep in mind, this is just the effigy mounds. So those are the most common. But there were conical mounds and Adena mounds that were built thousands of years before these. And then there were hundreds of mounds built after the effigy mounds, like by Mississippian people and Oneota people. And I know that there's some around here. This description is the best I was going to do for tonight. But I'm sure there are mounds that people don't even know about. A quick LiDAR survey would show them easily. So yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of mounds at Moundville. If you're curious, I have every issue of the Wisconsin Archaeologist back 100 years. If you email me, and I'll leave a couple copies of my card out. If you really want to know about Moundville, I could send you a copy of a few articles on it written by an archaeologist. Again, I know enough of archaeology to be dangerous.
Did the Indians migrate a lot?
Oh yeah,
between the
oh yeah.
seasons?
Well, first of all, before the French era, the tribes were probably relatively stable, and they didn't migrate just because of Europeans. First of all, going back to the Beaver Wars, this is going to cause a huge number of migrations. Virtually every tribe in southern Michigan migrates across the lake to what is today Wisconsin, and some of them, like the Kickapoo, they live in Mexico now. Yeah, just trying to keep track. Anytime you talk about native people in Wisconsin, you're not talking about centuries. Sometimes you're only talking decades or parts of centuries. So especially the wars caused just an immense amount of migration. And then after the Iroquois were basically subdued militarily, the Miamis who lived around here, then migrated back into Ohio and Indiana. The Maskoutens largely were absorbed into the Kickapoos. Yeah, it gets really confusing, and again, you know, it's something that yeah, I mean, I could go on for, that's a whole other talk, as I said, but suffice it to say, yeah, so the Ho-Chunk, I mean, if you invite a Ho-Chunk person, they'll say that they've lived around here since time immemorial. If we look at, you know, how, you know, there's a huge debate among archaeologists as when to the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk came. Another archaeologist, Dave Overstreet, who's a good friend of mine, he thinks they didn't come in until about 1000 AD. Not everybody agrees with him. The Ho-Chunk certainly don't. They believe, the Ho-Chunk traditionalists believe they've lived here since the beginning of creation. They'll admit that they may have been pushed into the, you know, out by refugees from the Iroquois Wars, but in the wake of the Iroquois Wars, they migrated back to the lands of their ancestors. Yes, sir.
The boundaries, and they kind of changed in different eras between the different tribes. Were those
These are
established?
approximate, to be sure.
Were they established by any physical features, or
No,
was it
they
just
usually,
kind of the
no, and
arbitrary
what you have to
over
understand is,
various wars and battles among?
yeah, well, that was part of it. I mean, the Ho-Chunk and the Iowa were closely related. You know, they just kind of came to an agreement as to, you know, where Ho-Chunk lands begin, where Iowa lands begin. As far as the Menominee, the Ho-Chunk and the Menominee were heavily intermarried. So they, you know, just family bonds allowed them to sort of on an annual basis negotiate who hunts where, who harvests rice where. You know, it was a mix, it was mostly done peacefully, particularly in the historic era where we have much better records and we know that. And again, you have to remember, tribes were, I mean, like the Sauk, for example, I've done a ton of research on the Sauk. The Sauk, who lived here around Saginaw, Michigan, that's where the word Saginaw comes from, they end up migrating ultimately to the Mississippi River Valley. You know, this was like 6,000 people. It was really sort of a big extended family. And they're heavily intermarried with the Meskwaki. So they could negotiate sort of on an annual basis as to what hunting grounds they would use, which ones they'd avoid. They didn't always agree, that could lead to clashes. Intertribal warfare probably killed more Indians than warfare with whites did. And the Sauk, in their later history, they went all the way out to Kansas to hunt buffalo. They were a mobile people, okay? Blackhawk he fought in the War of 1812 as far east as Ohio. He regularly went out to Kansas. I mean, he had been to Mackinac. You know, your average Indian is probably familiar with an area, you know, as big as the Western Great Lakes. That's one of the ways. I mean, so these are really approximate. They don't show a lot of the movements, especially the seasonal migrations like winter hunts and, you know, summer buffalo hunts and the like.
Did particularly the French first, did they care who controlled what as long as they were willing to deal with the French?
Basically.
Okay.
And the French, I mean, let there be no doubt, under the French and the British, and at least the early American regime, the Indians really held all the cards, because the fur trade was really important. So the French basically acknowledged Indian sovereignty. All they wanted was trade, and the Indians wanted trade as well. So, yeah, I mean, you see these maps. I mean, one thing I always tell everybody, you see something like this that says, well, this was French North America. Well, no. They may have controlled everything between Quebec and Montreal tightly. Everything else was just part of a large trade network where the Indians really held all the sovereignty. And that would be the case right up to the end of the French and Indian War. And the British would largely, and I spent 5 weeks in London this summer looking through the papers of this British Army officer in the 1760s to 1780s. And it's clear that even under the British just kind of continued the French policy of acknowledging Indian sovereignty and just trying to maintain peaceful, trade relations. Trade was the lubricant that really kind of kept peace between Europeans and native people. Any other questions? Oh, right here and then over here. Yes, sir. I didn't see, did you have any of two?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we go 1, 2, and then 3. Okay, go ahead.
In your research, have you come across any reference to the role of the Portage here in the Fox Wars?
Yeah, well, that quote by, and I don't speak French, I speak German and English, but number 5, that would be one. The actual fighting, there was one of the battles in Wisconsin was, it's called the Bell Site. It's around the Middle Fox River, around, I think, Lake Coygan. That was one battle site. No, it doesn't appear as much as you think, because it was crossed by both natives and the French, but there wasn't actually any, significant fighting here. That was in the Middle Fox River, which had a much larger population. There was a huge battle down in Illinois, I think west of Chicago. That's where the French just about annihilated the Milwaukee people. That quote that I gave you there, that was the one I could find. I could have probably spent a few days or weeks digging for a few more, but I doubt they would have been quite as descriptive. And I really wanted to focus on the landscape. I can recommend books. There's a book called The Fox Wars by Edmund Pizer, and yeah, that's still the best book. To some degree, Louise Phelps Kellogg, who included a chapter on it in her book, The French Regime, if you read that. It's Pizer, and I met R. David Edmonds. He's retired now, but he was a doyen of American Indian history. Number two, and then we'll get back to you, man. Go ahead, sir.
Is there any estimate how many beavers were in this whole area? I mean,
Oh.
it sounds like it was.
Well, first of all, there were lots, okay? And yeah, there are French sources that kind of list the number of beaver packs. Okay, there are sources in the French, there are French sources, British sources, and American sources that talk about the thousands of packs of beaver and marten. I mean, we're talking thousands here. And I could find that, I didn't put it in there, but yes, there are. There's both the French, the British, and the Americans all kept really good records of fur. I mean, we're talking packet. I mean, I noticed when I came in, if you look in the corner of the other room there, that white bound packet, that was about the size of a fur trade packet, okay? Filled with marten, beaver, or whatever fur. We're talking thousands. This was a huge, huge business. Every American Indian man, the population of American Indians in Wisconsin in say 1820 was probably about 25,000. Every man was engaged in it. There were probably 2,000 or 3,000 French, and this goes on for centuries. So yeah, there are plenty of records, but I don't. That's where you get the economic history, and that's boring. You're just kind of crunching numbers of pelts. But yes, they exist. If you're interested. I can probably find some and just email them to you. So I'll give you anybody who wants to email me my email after we're done. And yes, ma'am.
What was the approximate population of the natives when the Pilgrims landed?
Okay, in Wisconsin or in North America?
Well, both.
Okay, there is a huge debate, and this has been raging since I was in graduate school. What was the population of North America, north of Mexico, before at contact? Estimates go as low as 5 million, and then they go as high as 50 million. And again, there are pages of academic journals that have been filled with this debate. I think it's probably safe to say that North America itself probably had between 15 and 20 million. But that's based upon modeling. What archaeologists do is they will model like certain regions. They'll say that certain regions could hold a population of so many people. The only real population, for Wisconsin, you don't even get accurate census data till really the American period. And one of the things, I just had an article published last year, if you want to read it. It's really heavy-duty academic stuff. The publisher sent me a whole bunch of extra copies I'm trying to get rid of. But one of the things I did is talk about the population. See, the population of Wisconsin and the Western Great Lakes was pretty easy. The Indian Office kept track of it. So I estimate that, by the time the Americans get here, the population of Wisconsin, maybe a little bit of Illinois, Minnesota, was about 25,000. You have to remember they didn't have large populations, mainly because they had to maintain extensive hunting grounds. Now, during the French period, you probably have much larger populations. And again, these are things that are still heavily debated. The guy wrote the right map here. For the Ho-Chunk alone, the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk, they probably numbered 25,000 alone by the time the French came here. Probably all largely in the Fox River. If you look at that boy, this place is set up just perfect for my thought. Where it says Fox River there, That's probably where most of the population lived when Nicolay arrived, with some villages going all the way up to Green Bay. But the French estimates of just the Ho-Chunk were at 25,000. But they were corn growers, that's all, they grew corn. And they would do that right up to the present day. But, you know, the Iroquois had 40,000, the Hurons probably had 30,000, the Powhatan on the East Coast probably had 15 to 20,000. It's clear that the populations took a huge crash after contact, mostly due to smallpox and measles, that was the other big disease. And, you know, the populations recover, but there's huge debates on Indian population. There really is not a consensus, and it depends who you ask. I just gave you the safest answers I could. So, and again, these are things I don't study. I mean, to give you a medical example, you're asking me questions about the human heart right now, but I'm really ear, eyes, nose, and throat specialist. I know enough about the heart I can tell a layperson about it, but I really know a lot about the eye, ear, nose, and throat. I know a whole lot about the Western Great Lakes during the American period. I've written books on it. Okay, that's my real specialty, but I still have to know sort of a lot about the French and the British eras as well. Now that I just spent 5 weeks in London at the British Library, I'm going to take the rest of my career just to focus on the British era. I've written about the American period. This was sort of, this article that I just had published on American Indian resistance, as I say, it's really heavy-duty academic stuff, but this is sort of like my swan song for writing about the American period. I've been thinking about that article for 20 years, so finally I had a chance to write it. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Okay, the Native Americans going back beyond Nicolay, did they come out of Canada or across
yeah.
Russia?
Trying to figure out human migrations before contact, because before contact there's no written records. The Maya had them and the Aztecs had them, but nobody in North America did. Okay, so again, this is where there's the debate is almost completely between archaeologists. Okay, now again, just to give you one idea, the Algonquian tribes like the Ojibwa, the Potawatomi, these tribes probably migrated into the Western Great Lakes. I am willing to bet about the time of Christ, or not shortly thereafter. That's about 1 AD. The Ho-Chunk, at least the archaeological theory that I buy into, just because I talked to my buddy Dave a lot, they came in probably about 1000 AD. Okay, archaeologists try to track the migrations based on artifacts, but just like population, there's huge debates, and there are archaeological journals that are just filled with that. But I think that's relatively safe. Algonquian tribes were probably here around the time of Christ. Where they came from, who preceded them, that's a huge question. A lot of this is reconstructed from either artifacts or from language. The Ho-Chunk, I'm willing to bet they came in probably about 1000 AD. And by the time Nicolay gets here, 600 years later, they're heavily established in the Fox River Valley all the way down to Portage. And then from Portage to the west, that's closely related to Iowa people. And even then, I could find probably 5 or 6 archaeologists who would take issue with what I just said. But I find another 5 who would say, oh, you're right on the money. So, but prehistoric migrations gets very difficult in any part of the world. When you don't have written records and you're just depending on artifacts, that gets to be a very difficult to determine with any degree of certainty.
But then the animals crossed up on the
Okay, well,
streets.
okay, yeah, okay. Okay, if we want to go back that far to like the Paleo period, yes, we know that American Indians migrated into North America around 25,000 years ago. That is proven mostly through genetics. Okay, that's the new tool that archaeologists have used. I think there's no doubt that the first American Indians crossed the Bering Language during the last ice age about 25,000 years ago. But then trying to figure out how they differentiate themselves over the course of 25,000 years, that gets really, really, really hard. That gets really hard. So, but yeah, 25,000 years, that's the accepted date. But that's confirmed mostly through genetics and through genetics. What they did is they found pure-blooded American Indians throughout the Americas. They compared that to DNA from related people in northeastern Asia, a lot of Siberic peoples. And just by looking at the mitochondrial DNA, which is always inherited from the mother, and basically there'll be genetic changes to mitochondrial DNA at a very predictable rate. Geneticists working with archaeologists have pretty much pinpointed that. There were 4 waves of migrations across the Bering Land Bridge about 25,000 years ago, and I think that's very secure. But trying to figure out differentiation after that gets really difficult. Any other questions? Let me see what time it is here. Oh, it's about 7:30, so that was an hour. I figure people start getting fidgety after that. My students always do. If you have any other questions, I can hang out for a few minutes. I'm gonna put copies of I want my business cards from the band, I left them there, so I might have some in my wallet though. But anyway, if you want to email me, I'd be more than happy to talk to you some more. If you want to put yourself to sleep tonight, you can take the last few copies of this and slug through a 30-page article on American Indian resistance during the American period. And thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.